y'all, it's Mary Hyatt, and I'm so excited you're here for this month's topic, which is all about pleasure. But before we hop into today's episode, I thought I would ask, are you scared to feel it? Does it trigger you? Does it make your body tighten? Well, if you answered yes to any of those questions, you are not alone. But if you hang with me, I think I might be able to change your mind. This month, we'll explore what pleasure is, what happens when it gets repressed and turned sideways, and help you find healthy ways to embrace it in your everyday life. All right, guys, I'll see you inside this week's episode.
Welcome to the Living Fully Alive podcast with Mary Hyatt, here to help you find your authentic voice, learn how to love yourself, and embrace your life. And now, your host, life and mindset coach, body love advocate, and doTERRA presidential diamond, Mary Hyatt.
Hey y'all, it's Mary Hyatt, and I'm so excited to have our first episode around this month's topic of pleasure. Woo, buddy. And I had to say that I really am excited about this month because it's something that I think we are just deeply hungry for and yet deeply afraid of. It's a tricky topic, honestly, to talk about, and it comes with a lot of triggers. And yet, I feel like on some kind of visceral level, we have this desire for more pleasure, but we don't know how to talk about it. I mean, even when I brought this up with my part-time co-host, Lindsley, we were kind of having a hard time talking about it outside of the context of sexuality. And I was like, no, like not sexual pleasure. That's not what I want to talk about. That's like a whole other month's topic. I said, but like pleasure, in life's everyday little pleasures. And it's not something that people spend a lot of time thinking about, honestly. But when I asked on my Instagram story what you guys wanted this next month's topic to be, it was so interesting. I loved getting those responses because the majority of y'all said pleasure. And I gave you a whole host of other options, but the majority, why we decided to do it for this month, was because y'all said pleasure. You wanted to have a conversation about pleasure. And I was like, yes, okay, all right, awesome, let's do it. Let's talk about it. Because at the end of the day, I really believe that we just want to feel radiantly alive. We want to be the fullest versions of ourselves and experience life in a way that lights us up. And we're longing for something more. I think deep down, we all kind of want to scream, like, uncle, to life. Like, when did it become cool to not enjoy life? When did it become so posh to stop indulging in life's sweetness? When did it become a status symbol to be stressed out, to be thin, to be exhausted all the time as women? And I'm pretty sure if we were to really admit it, we just want someone to call BS on this agreement and remind us to live life. So that's what I'm going to do, y'all. I am calling BS on it and inviting you to live life because I'm sorry, but 2 weeks a year for vacation is not going to make up for the other 351 days of misery and hell. I mean, the scales are just too unbalanced. So how can we take a look at pleasure as something that we can make space to prioritize and ultimately sort of make pleasure a non-negotiable in our lives? And I think that it starts with creating a new definition of pleasure that doesn't make it so scary. And like I said, it's such a triggering word. But to me, if we were to kind of detach it from sexuality for a second, even though, of course, that's part of pleasure and all that. But if we detach it from sexuality, and maybe a better word that we can use with pleasure is sensuality. Because pleasure to me is wrapped up in the enjoyment of being alive. Now, the actual definition, according to Webster's, is a feeling of happy satisfaction and enjoyment. It's being willing to believe, and this is okay, that's all for that definition. I want to be clear. That was it. So this is now me. It's being willing to believe in a good universe, being willing to move from this state of survival that I feel like we just default into. And pleasure sort of helps us come back to thriving. In essence, it's sort of a way of saying, I feel safe enough to feel good. And we practice feeling miserable, stressed out, exhausted, worn out, fearful, anxiety ridden, doubtful. We practice that all day, every day. We know that. And I think that there's this fear around pleasure. I think there's a big fear. We'll talk about this next week with Lindsley when we have our discussion, but there's a big fear, like what if I let myself feel it and then it gets taken away? What if it's, that same experience I've had before where I let things get good and then the rug was pulled out from under me. So in essence, pleasure is sort of saying like, I trust life. I feel safe enough to feel good. And when we experience pleasure, we're really saying yes to life. It's in a way that it's a way that we're really engaging with life. It's a way of experiencing the very essence of celebration of what is here right now in the present. It's a kind of release that says, I can trust in this moment. And of course, pleasure doesn't mean that hard things don't happen. Hard things aren't, on everybody's experiential list. But what it is saying is that it's safe to engage with life right now, that there is time to enjoy this. There is time to embody this. I mean, that's why we get out of that lizard fight, flight, or freeze. Y'all, struggle's real. But we get out of that sort of lizard primitive brain that is just in it to survive. And it invites us into sort of a higher evolution of our mind, a different part, honestly, of our brain that gets activated when we move into pleasure than when we are in that lizard brain, that primal brain, that survival brain. And when we choose not to let ourselves feel pleasure, it's kind of like a refusal of living fully alive when you really think about it. But it's complicated, like I mentioned, because we as women in particular, I think maybe more so than men, have been taught to ignore our desires, to not get too much pleasure out of something. We are taught not to enjoy food, to not want too much, to disconnect from our bodies, to quiet our urges, to be okay being quote unquote, metaphorically hungry all the time. It's like a life diet. And so when we aren't allowing ourselves to experience pleasure, we feel constricted. We feel it's short, it's tightened. Everything is hurried, everything is frantic. We're disconnected. We feel like robots just going through the motions, or even worse, The Walking Dead. And we miss the moment. We miss the moment. Pleasure requires presence. It requires that we are, as Abraham Hicks would say, tuned in, tapped in, turned on. It requires that we feel. It requires that we be. Pleasure is to be found right here, right now. We have to be in the moment to experience pleasure. It's really such a beautiful thing. And pleasure, as you guys know, it's like, I think it gets a bad rap because it requires oftentimes something outside of ourselves in order to experience pleasure, like something or someone giving us pleasure. And Eckhart Tolle says, whom I adore and love, he says, pleasure is always derived from something outside you, whereas joy arises from within. So if you were to compare, some might say that joy is a better thing to strive for, and that pleasure is sort of this fleeting, euphoric sort of experience that takes you out, actually, of the present moment. And in the past, there would have been a time where I probably would have looked at that quote and not questioned it and completely agreed with it. However, I think what happens when we start creating a hierarchy of emotions is that we make some out to be bad and some out to be good. Like, okay, well, joy is better than pleasure, or happiness is below joy. And so we sort of have this hierarchy. And so we only strive for one, or think that other ones aren't really worth putting time and attention and focus on. And my personal belief is that there is this beautiful rainbow of emotions, and all of them are important. All of them have their place, and I think that pleasure is incredibly important. And I think sometimes the way in which that we explain and define pleasure is just the way we describe it, it's just a perversion of pleasure. And like anything, there is a tipping point where it becomes unhealthy, where it becomes destructive, where it becomes toxic. But I think, on the contrary, real, pure pleasure invites us into the present moment. And I would argue it actually walks us back to our innate joy, that joy that's always there. That pleasure reminds us of our joy. It points us back there so that we can connect to our essence, our spirit, our original goodness. And I think we need both. I think we need pleasure, and we need to be able to access our joy. So let me just say, too, that next week, Lindsley and I will be having this whole bigger, broader conversation around what happens when pleasure gets suppressed or exploited or comes out sideways. So we'll get into why we're so afraid of pleasure, especially as women. But for our conversation today, I want to stick with sort of this purity of pleasure and the gift of it. But what I love about pleasure is that it shows us what we value in our lives when we aren't striving from our ego, trying to earn love, trying to prove ourselves. It allows us to open up to life and let that sweetness in. It shows us what lights us up, what turns us on, what stokes our fire, what awakens our hearts. And not everyone finds the same two things pleasurable. I mean, it really is about what makes us uniquely come alive. And that's really important. We have to understand what makes us tick, what gets us excited, because pleasure draws us forward. It's a very motivating thing. Tony Robbins talks about there's two ways that people change: the avoidance of pain or the pursuit of pleasure. And when we can envision a future that is so pleasurable, that gives us these beautiful feelings of joy and happiness and peace and freedom and all of these things, that those kinds of emotions can be so pleasurable that we will do almost anything to get there. And I like that. I like focusing on pleasure way more than I like trying to just avoid pain. So pleasure can be a really powerful way for us to create change in our lives. And it allows us, when we kind of understand how it's hardwired in us specifically, what really makes us how we find our pleasure, it allows us to feel fully alive, how we were specifically wired to experience the joys of life. The experience of pleasure is about us, about what makes us tick. I don't know if you guys ever saw the French movie Amélie. Y'all, oh my gosh. It is totally one of my favorite modern French films. But I used to watch it in high school. And I was just so mesmerized by the story, and it's just French in every way. And I loved it. I loved the romance of it. I loved all of the things. But in the movie, there's just one scene, and Amélie is exploring pleasure, and she says, or the narrator goes, instead, she cultivates a taste for small pleasures, dipping her hands into sacks of grain, cracking creme brulee with a teaspoon, and skipping stones at St. Martin's Canal. Now, I don't know if it was the melodic sounds of French piano music playing in the background, or the way that the camera zoomed in and out in each of these experiences, or the bright color red of her dress and her lipstick, just so impeccably French. Or maybe I just love this man's voice, his French voice, as he narrates the story. But I always remember that scene. In fact, when I think about other countries like France or Italy, I feel like they get pleasure, don't they? I mean, they really get it. They eat decadent chocolate. They take long strolls. I mean, when was the last time you strolled? Not like went for a walk, but strolled. We don't stroll in America so much. It's not like really a thing. I went to my amazing doctor, Dr. Motley, the other day, and he was doing some muscle testing on me, and he actually said, he goes, "Your body is really asking for a stroll." And he goes, "Not like a walk, not a brisk walk, not a jog, not a run, but like a stroll." My adrenals have been really shot and fatigued. And so it was like, okay, I'm just going to stroll. I'm just going to stroll, but the French, the Italians, they drink wine, they have fresh flowers in their house. Pleasure. They get pleasure. They prioritize it. And I really think that we should too. Now, I don't want you to take my word for it. I kind of want to show you what pleasure can actually do for you. And that is why I want to go over today my 3 reasons why you need to prioritize pleasure in your life. Hey y'all, I just wanted to interrupt this episode real quick to remind you to subscribe to this podcast. I know the emails get lost in your spam folder, so subscribing means my episodes come right to your phone. That way you won't miss out on any of the Living Fully Alive episodes. And speaking of episodes, I hope that you are thoroughly enjoying this month's new topic of pleasure. Next week, Lindsley and I will keep this conversation going with a super raw conversation about why we're so triggered by the word pleasure, why and when it goes wonky and comes out sideways, and ultimately what you can do about it to bring it back into balance. You're not going to want to miss this conversation because you know it's going to be juicy. So make sure to subscribe and we'll see you next week. All right, now back to this week's episode. So the first and possibly my favorite reason why you need to prioritize pleasure, number 1, is to embrace the goodness with a capital G. Embrace the goodness. Y'all, you know this because you live it. I've lived it, can fall into this so easily, but oftentimes we practice a life, meaning we live this over and over and over and over and over and over again. We practice a life of deprivation, restriction, and control. And we live our lives with the unspoken mantra of, I don't deserve this, or I'm not allowed to have this, or no, this is too much. That's okay, I'm fine, I don't need that. We resist goodness. We resist blessings. We resist bigness. We resist enoughness. And we just settle for a life that is okay. Not even good, especially not great, but just okay. And I think that prioritizing pleasure is a way to help us embrace the goodness, capital G, the goodness that is available to us all the time, to really embrace it. The other day I was talking with my amazing, beautiful, phenomenal assistant, Liz, and both of us are a type 2 on the Enneagram. And so we have these little 2 moments, which is the helper. If you're not familiar, it's a personality profile assessment, the Enneagram. And we're both a 2. And so we're always sort of trying to outdo each other and how we help each other. It's like, oh my God, thank you so much. You helped me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, well, let me do this for you. And oh my gosh, she's like, no, let me do this for you. And so we just, go back and forth in this help fest, and it's just hilarious. And so we were talking one day about abundance, and we were talking about just the idea that we live in an abundant world. And part of our work as a 2, when we're giving, is learning how to open up and receive. And so I don't think she would mind me saying this, but I feel like I'm a little bit further along in this journey than she is. And so I was sort of, having this coaching moment with her. And I said, Liz, it's like, imagine that you are sitting down at this table, that God has, your higher power, universe, however you want to phrase it, has laden out this food all over the table. The most gorgeous cheeses and meats and fruits and vegetables and wine and chocolate and you can just imagine, like a true feast. And then you come up to the table and you pull up to the table and you say, I'll just have one grape. That's good enough. I'll just have one grape. And God's like, girl, you can have it. It's all right here. And as soon as you take it, replenishes. Like it's just this beautiful feast, a magical feast. And yet most of our lives, we come to the table and we say, I'll just take a grape. And so we have this huge joke now that we're going to get tattoos of grapes on us, and we're like, F the grape, we want the feast. But it's just sort of this picture, this mental image of how we typically live our lives. And we're afraid to receive and to feast. And, when we talk about pleasure, there's a whole separate conversation that we could have around food and how this whole concept is mirrored and how we eat food and how we diet, and all of that is just fascinating. But there are several incredible books that are written on that topic, including one called Women, Food, and God by Janine Roth. And if you have not read that book, I highly recommend it. But the idea of pleasure is it's safe to let the goodness in. It's safe to explore the things that open you up to all the abundance around you. Tasting the food, ordering the dessert, buying the plush towels, feeling the breeze on your skin. These are all gifts that are here right now. Pleasure is the amen to life's blessings. It's saying, yes, there is goodness here. There is something to be celebrated here. There is something that feels good right now. If I allow it, if I let myself feast on it, it's opening up and embracing the goodness. And this is a really important distinction. It's about receiving, not taking, but receiving. It's like there is this gift that's being offered to you in the form of things that you can find pleasurable. Again, we're talking about that purity of pleasure, right? But that you are able to open up and receive, to partake, to commune. It's the Eucharist of life. And it is just so powerful when we can embrace this goodness. So when we prioritize pleasure, it invites us to the table to eat the feast, to enjoy it, to share it, to laugh with it. I mean, it is the amen to life's blessings. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like that's a quotable. I'm probably going to have to make a graphic and put it on my Instagram. I just think it's so important. So that's the first reason why I think you need to prioritize pleasure, so that you can embrace the goodness. The second reason is that it gives us permission to be human. Y'all, I'm going to have a little preach moment here. But sometimes being human gets a bad rap. In fact, much of what we do in our life is to try to disconnect from the human experience. We try to avoid pain. We try to numb out. We try to cope. We check out. We try to not feel. We try to fix ourselves to the point where we are so up in the clouds and of our theology and mysticism or whatever that we're always sort of looking for an out-of-body experience. We want to control and we want to manipulate our way through life. We don't want to be human. And the minute that we enjoy something that feels like too much, or if we feel sad for too long, or we get exhausted, these are all things that happen when we're allowing ourselves to be human. We just try to pretend that we're above all that. We're like, no, I'm fine. I got it. And we isolate, we shut down, we don't ask for help. And pleasure to me is what connects us to our humanness. So of course we want to avoid it because we have a practice of avoiding our humanness. We want to make it bad. We want to try to quiet it. We say it's not necessary, that somehow being above pleasure is of a higher calling. But last time I checked, y'all, we are all here on this planet Earth having a human experience. We are human. Like, let that sink in just for a second. We are human having a human experience. And so often we've been taught to ascend our humanness that sometimes I think there was this sort of message that being human is bad. And of course, like I said earlier, there's a tipping point. I mean, with anything, there's a point when things become unhealthy. But I think when we're checked and we are accountable and when we are healthy, being a human is kind of what we signed up for. Being a human is part of our experience here. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. The way that I see it from a super like rudimental comment, is that right word? Rudimental? Common sense perspective is that if we were not meant to experience pleasure, we would not have our five senses. Think about that for a second. Everything would be tasteless, monotone, black and white. It wouldn't matter. And yet, there is something to be said for the fact that we as human beings were created with the ability to feel and experience pleasure, to taste, to smell, to hear, to see, and to feel. If you think about our five senses, what other purpose do they provide other than pleasure? To see beauty, to hear music that moves us, to see art that moves us. I mean, when you think about all of our senses, the taste of food, all of that, like there's no real purpose. Like we don't need to taste our food to survive. We don't need to be able to see color in order to make sure we're going the right place. And yet all of this is, I truly believe, designed with a purpose for that experience of pleasure, to be human. And so I think that pleasure is one of those ways that welcomes us back to our human nature. And when we aren't using pleasure to cope, but rather to engage in life from a healthy human way, it is such a gift. It's a way to give ourselves permission to be human. Now, the third reason why I think it's so important to prioritize pleasure, and this is literally what my entire brand is centered around, what my whole life really is centered around, is that it invites us to be fully alive. It is a quest to get curious about what lights you up. Pleasure sort of releases this tight grip that we have on life, and it asks us to soften. I think it's a very feminine experience. This kind of pleasuring, experiencing through our life, because so often we are living or looking at life as though it were 2D. And pleasure makes our lives brighter. It shifts our experience of life into three-dimensional. We become awake to it. We feel it. We're in it. Like we are living. Pleasure is a celebration of life. It moves us out of that survival mode and invites us to thrive. It's a way to intentionally create psychological, mental, emotional margin in our lives. It's like it opens up, it expands, it creates space so that when you're in the moment, you can actually feel alive. It honestly brings us back to life. It calls for presence. It calls for gratitude. It calls us to be in the moment. It literally wakes us up from a life run on autopilot of checking things off of our to-do list and says, hey, you, open your eyes, open your heart, breathe, feel, live right now. And that's why I just think it's so important to prioritize pleasure so that you can embrace this goodness, so that you can give yourself permission to have this human experience, and it invites us to be fully alive. So, what does prioritizing pleasure look like for you? How can you make this part of your everyday life? Like, what is something that you want to experience more of? How can you prioritize it? Because I know I'm guilty of this. I've gotten stuck in that trap of saying, okay, well, as soon as I get this stuff finished, or as soon as I get that promotion, or as soon as I can afford assistant, as soon as this thing is taken care of, then I'll make time for pleasure, or I'll have earned a break and then I'll indulge in some pleasure. But we never really do that, do we? I mean, honestly, we just keep on cycling through the stress. And just when we think it's all over, we sort of sign up for another bout with it. And I don't want that to be the case for you. I want you to prioritize this so that you can come back to life, so that you can engage with the sweetness of life. Mama Gina, she says, a desire is anything but frivolous. It is the interface between you and that which is greater than you. No desire is meaningless or inconsequential. If it pulls you even a little bit, it will take everyone higher. Desire is where the divine lives, inside the inspiration of your desire. Every desire is of profound importance with huge consequences and deserves your attention. So here's a little fun way that I make pleasure a priority and help others make pleasure a priority. So growing up, my mom, every day we would go to school and she would say, okay, now I want you to go on a hunt today. And I want you to be on the lookout for treasure today. And she would say, okay, so when you get home, I'm going to ask you, what treasure did you find? What was the best thing that happened to you today? And literally every day we would have, every night, this is back in the day when people actually ate food and dinner as a family at the dinner table. So every night we would, get around the dinner table and we would eat. Mom would cook and she would go around. I have 4 sisters. And so this took some time. But she was so intentional in this, and she would go around and ask us, what was the best thing that happened to you today? What treasure did you find? And I love that. And it's fun because my sisters who have kids, they now do that with their kids, and it's become a fun little family tradition. So I've sort of updated this for this purpose. And I tell my clients, I say, all right, your job is to go on a pleasure hunt. So a little bit different than a treasure hunt, but probably I think my mom was kind of hitting at this, a pleasure hunt. And the amazing thing is that nothing has to change in your life for you to find pleasure. But the idea here is to find those little things that bring you pleasure throughout your day, kind of like in that Amelie movie that I referenced earlier. And so I'll tell you what I tell my coaching clients. I say, all right, for the next 5 days, I want you to find 10 things that bring you pleasure and jot them down in a journal. And so the idea here is to up your awareness of what you find pleasurable, because most of us don't know, because often we've been too afraid to look or experience it or feel it. Most of us don't know what brings us pleasure. So if we want to experience more of it, if we want to prioritize it, we first have to figure out what brings us pleasure. We don't know. So this is just a little exercise to go on a pleasure hunt and find those things that bring you pleasure. Because then you can start to focus on it. Then you can start to magnify it, biggie size it, make it bigger, and become even more intentional about experiencing and prioritizing pleasure. But we first have to get clarity on what it is that does bring you pleasure. And it doesn't take extra time. It only requires extra awareness. It's like things that you're already doing, things that you're already seeing, that you're tasting, that you're touching. It doesn't cost any extra money. It's simply opening up to receive and be present for what is already here. Does that make sense? Like it's nothing extra. It's just opening up to life as it is. Again, embracing that goodness, allowing it in. So I want to end with this. I think that Janine Roth, she's the author that I mentioned earlier that wrote the book Women, Food, and God. I'll make sure to link add it in the show notes. But She says, this is such an amazing quote from that book. She says, we don't want to eat hot fudge sundaes as much as we want our lives to be hot fudge sundaes. We want to come home to ourselves. We want to know wonder and delight and passion. And if instead we've given up on ourselves, if we've vacated our longings, if we've left possibility behind, we will feel an emptiness we can't name. We will feel as if something is missing because something is missing. The connection to the source of all sweetness, all love, all power, all peace, all joy, all stillness. Since we had it once, we were born with it. it can't help but haunt us. It's as if our cells remember that home is a jeweled palace, but we've been living as beggars for so long that we are no longer certain if the palace was a dream. And if it was a dream, then at least we can eat the memory of it. I go back to that over and over and over again. We don't want to eat hot fudge sundaes as much as we want our lives to be hot fudge sundaes. And I don't want us to be beggars for a life that is right here being offered to you. I want you to prioritize pleasure so that you can truly live a life that you are turned on for and fully alive in, and open up and welcome in a life that is available to you right now in this present moment. Oh, y'all, I'm so excited to carry on this conversation of pleasure next week in my conversation with Lindsley. And like I said, we're going to kind of get into what happens when pleasure goes wonky and gets, sideways, and when we start to cope and numb with pleasure and all of that. So we'll kind of get into that conversation, which I think is going to be so fascinating and exciting to discuss. So you're not going to want to miss that. But until then, go on a little pleasure hunt. Find those things that bring you pleasure. Start getting curious. Start becoming more aware and present in your everyday life. And remember, the purpose of life is to be grateful, to be great, and to be full. All right, I'll talk to you guys with Lindsley next week. Bye. If you loved today's episode, make sure to share it with your girlfriends and invite them into this month's topic of pleasure. And if you want to keep the discovery journey going of living more fully alive, check out all my past episodes from the podcast over at maryhyatt.com/show. Plus, you'll be able to grab the show notes for this episode, along with the essential oil recipe of the month that will help you open up to the gift of experiencing pleasure so that you can truly embrace this present moment and be fully alive. Again, that's maryhyatt.com/show. See y'all next week.